Look, so in this video, we're going to talk about Edward Bond's play, The Sea. This is a play that kind of snuck up on me. For most of the play, I was not a big fan as I was reading this. What I got the sense that this is a play that is very interested in philosophy, but doesn't necessarily have a coherent philosophy throughout much of it. You get a number of different people presenting a number of different perspectives, all of which seems somewhat reasonable, and yet, as a whole, it doesn't, for the most part, really hang together for me. So, this is set in a small English seaside town in 1907 on the east coast of England. There is basically, we start with a drowning. There is it's a weird opening scene. There's Willie, who was out on this boat in a storm with his best friend. They've sunk. His friend Colin is lost in the ocean, and Willie is trying to find him. Evans, who is he's an alcoholic who sort of lives on the beach in a shack, and he seems to has a great deal of insight, but he has no real social position as such in the community. Evans comes along, he's drunk, so he can't help. But then this other character comes in, named Hatch. Hatch is part of the Coast Guard, which in this context means that they're the people who watch out for ships. They watch out for sinking ships in particular, or boats, and then they attempt to rescue anyone lost at sea. Hatch, who's the town draper, basically a sort of tailor, he is convinced that aliens are invading the Earth, and that they are doing it primarily via the east coast of England. And he is convinced that Willie and Colin are aliens trying to come and take over this town. And so Hatch makes no attempt to help rescue Colin, and he sort of drives Willie back into the sea. Colin, as it turns out, was engaged to the niece, I think, of Mrs. Raffy, who's one of the sort of town bigwigs. When she finds out, so Hatch is really dependent on her business, which is a risky proposition because she's very, very picky, but also she has a tendency to order expensive stuff and then want it sent back, which has put Hatch's business in a precarious position. And so we do get the sense that part of his paranoia, part of his delusion, is rooted in his own financial troubles, in the context of this very stratified society. Hatch has recruited a couple of other people into his sort of group. Hollercut, who's kind of his assistant, and Thompson, who's actually Mrs. Raffy's gardener. So they're all sort of in this together, and they start watching Willie. They're also suspicious of Evans, because he lives on the beach, and he's just out there doing his own thing. Willie strikes up kind of an association, not necessarily a friendship, with Evans, because Evans knows the waters. Like that's his thing that people sort of talk about with him. He can predict where a body is going to wash up. And this is a big thing in a town, in a society in which people very often drown in the ocean. So Willie goes to Evans to figure out where Colin's body is going to wash up. Evans makes his prediction. Turns out it was right. While that is going on, Mrs. Raffi and her sort of gaggle of socialite women are rehearsing to put on a charity play to benefit the Coast Guard Fund. So that's a whole portion of it, and we see the social interactions between these characters, with Mrs. Raffi really lording it over everybody else. We'd already seen her lording it over Hatch, but now we see that within her own social circle, this is her consistent behavior. So we get those elements of it. When Mrs. Raffi learns that Hatch played a role in Colin's drowning, again, the fiancé of her niece, she determines that she's no longer going to buy from his shop, which is in itself a huge economic blow for him, but he's also ordered her expensive fabric to make curtains, which she wants sent back. The problem is, at her request, he's sent back so many things that the manufacturers now require him to pay up front. And so he's out a bunch of money. And so he kind of snaps, and he threatens Mrs. Raffi, he threatens her sort of sidekick, and then he runs off. When he runs off, he goes down to the beach. He actually finds... So Willie and Rose, Collins' fiancé, who's kind of a flat character, who's sort of just weirdly hovering in the background as this sort of vague, ethereal presence. Rose and Willie actually find Colin's body. Rose goes to get Evans so they can sort of take the body to have a proper funeral. While they're doing that, and Willie is watching over the body, Hatch comes in, and he thinks, in his sort of paranoid delusion, that Collins' body is Willie sleeping on the beach. So he stabs it a bunch of times with a knife. Because the body has been in the ocean, what comes out is water and not blood. And so Hatch freaks out even more. He ends up running off. Willie goes back over to the body. Evans and Rose show back up, and then they basically take the body and they go for a funeral. The funeral itself is a weird, sort of disastrous affair. They want to spread Colin's ashes, and there's a whole big production, and Mrs. Raffi's sidekick kind of like goes into some weird, almost hysterics. Mrs. Raffi freaks out and just like accuses her of trying to destroy this moment and stuff like this. And then in this sort of bizarre turn, Mrs. Raffi just declares that all this crazy fighting and shit that just happened at this funeral didn't really happen. She's like, Hatch also shows up, and he tries to stab some people, does some craziness. So she sort of declaims this, basically. Ladies, attention. I think I may say that everything was going very well today until Mr. Hatch came on with his lunacy. Our behavior was, as usual, an example to the town. Again, they've had this crazy blowout over, like, accusations of histrionics and sort of over-dramatizing this funeral, whatever it is. So the ladies all say yes. Mrs. Raffi says, no doubt some of us have been moved by the high emotionalism of the occasion. Mrs. Tilehouse, that's the sidekick who had done weird, like, loudly looking through her bag for her smelling salts, says, "Ah, yes, how true." Mrs. Rafi says, "But that is only proper. Indeed, it shows the depth of our feelings. No more will be said no more will be said about that by anyone." So she just declares again that this is what um, this is what happened. The thing that occurred didn't occur because it's unseemly, and this is kind of her thing in this play. And then shortly after she basically sends everybody else away, um, she makes this speech to Willie, and it's kind of a weird speech in which she's basically like, "What people expect of me is to be cruel and domineering. I do this not because I want to, but I do it basically as a service to them, because it's what they expect of someone in my social position. And if I'm nice to them, if I behave the way that I, as an individual, would actually want to behave, people will be disappointed." And so this is kind of her philosophy. Like, she gets to state her perspective here. Hatch, earlier in the play, states his philosophical perspective about, like, the threat posed by aliens and the importance of bravery and standing up for your country and rah-rah, whatever it is. Evans kind of gives a philosophical speech where he's basically just like, yeah, people are cruel and arbitrary, and the world is cruel and arbitrary. And again, I feel like throughout most of the play, what we get is a kind of jumble of vaguely philosophical ideas that aren't really developed and don't seem to be the sort of driving idea of the play. And I think this was not an uncommon thing for sort of left-wing theater in the 60s and into the 70s. This idea of, like, here's a mishmash of stuff that isn't super, super coherent in a framework that isn't necessarily that interesting either. I don't know, maybe that's a harsh assessment of this play, but that's kind of how I read it. But, as I said at the beginning, this play snuck up on me because, at the end, Evans actually gives us what I think is a really good philosophical statement that kind of makes everything else coalesce into something meaningful. So what he says here, I'm going to give you the whole speech, even though it's kind of long. He says, "I believe in the rat. What's the worst thing you can imagine? The universe is lived in by things that kill, and this has gone on for a long time. Sometimes the universe is crowded with killing things, or at any rate there are great pools of them in space. Perhaps that's so now. At other times it falls out that they've killed everything off, including each other, of course, and the universe is almost deserted. But not quite. Somewhere on a star, a rat will hide under a stone. It will look out on the broken desert, and from time to time it will scatter out to feed on the debris." Sorry, there's construction outside, and they're being very loud, so I don't know if my mic is picking that up. It will look out on the broken desert, and from time to time it will scatter out to feed on the debris. A shambling, lolloping great rat, like a fat woman with shopping bags running for a bus. Then it scuttles back to its nest and breeds, because rats build nests. And in time it will change into things that fly and swim and crawl and run. And one day it will change into the rat catcher. I believe in the rat because he has the seeds of the rat catcher in him. I believe in the rat catcher. I believe in sand and stone and water because the wind stirs them into a dirty sea and it gives birth to living things. The universe lives. It teems with life. Men take themselves to be very strong and cunning, but who can kill space or time or dust? They destroy everything, but they only make the materials of life. All destruction is finally petty, and in the end, life laughs at death. Willie says, then it goes on and on. But if it fails in the end, if it always goes back to the rat? Even says, I also believe in the wise rat catcher. He can bear to live in the minutes as well as the years, and he understands the voice of the thing he is going to kill. Suffering is a universal language, and everything that has a voice is human. We sit here in the world of changes. When your life's over, everything will be changed or have started to change. Our brains won't be big enough. They'll plug into bigger brains. Then they'll get rid of this body. It's too liable to get ill and break. They'll transplant the essential things into a better container. An unbreakable glass bottle on steel stilts. Men will look at each other's viscera as they pass in the street. There'll be no more grass. Why? What's it for? There'll be no more tragedy. There's no tragedy without grass for you to play it on. Well, without tragedy, no one can laugh. There's only discipline and madness. You see why the Draper's afraid, not of things from space, of us. We're becoming the strange visitors to this world. Willie says perhaps a better world. Even says, then why will they fill it with bombs and germs and gas? You'll live in a time when that happens and people will do nothing. They'll sit on the ground and say, perhaps a better world. So I think this is actually the sort of overall coalescing idea of the sea, is this sort of existential terror of creative destruction, right? The idea that the process of creation itself involves a movement through destruction. And this is, on a cosmic scale, existentially kind of terrifying. The idea that the universe is cyclical in some way, that it varies between the success of thriving, teeming life and the near catastrophic destruction of life as such. And then on these massively, unimaginably long timelines, these things just come and go back and forth. And that's what Even sort of presents. But this is also linked to, but this isn't an existentialist play, right? Bond is not an existentialist. He believes in the rational theater, which is very concerned with the world that we find ourselves in. And so that's why we get at the end this notion that humanity's preference or proclivity for war and horror, for making the world a horrific place through the use of increasingly sophisticated violence, that this is reflected in the existential terror of the universe, of these cycles of death and recreation.